Well, ladies and gentlemen, we do have a big update when it comes to the 18th NRL licence. And it seems there has been a big twist. All of the dialogue a couple of weeks ago was that the team in Papua New Guinea was done, signed, sealed and delivered for $600 million from the Australian federal government over a period of 10 years. And the logic towards that Papua New Guinea bid was that it would be some diplomacy and a ploy to strengthen Australia's relationship with the nations of the Pacific, because we know China is encroaching in that region. And it was reported by Ben Fordham of 2GB in Sydney that it was done, but it appears now that Perth in Western Australia may have beaten Papua New Guinea to the 18th licence. And this report from Glenn Quartermain in the West Australian newspaper, WA has emerged as the front runner to win the NRL's 18th licence. A Perth team looks likely to enter the national competition in either 2027 or 2028 before PNG. PNG was previously considered the NRL's first pick for expansion on the back of a promise of $600 million in federal government funding. But Perth's bid is now considered more advanced and compelling. And I think it always was more advanced and compelling when you think about it, because the PNG situation is never going to make money. It is purely reliant on federal government funding. And when you consider now that there's no certainty that the Labor government is going to be in power after the next election next year, it is going to ask a lot of questions of the NRL if they award the team to PNG now and have to take it off them next year. The ARL Commission will finalise their expansion plans when they meet before next Wednesday, before the State of Origin match in the city of Melbourne, and they are expected to call for expressions of interest for both an 18th and 19th licence. So I think what the article is hinting here is that Perth will come in first and then PNG will get the 19th licence. But I wouldn't think that is necessarily going to happen. Now, we do know WA has been talked about for a number of years now in terms of a potential NRL expansion side. There was a bid put together right around 10 years ago, the Perth Pirates, from memory, that never really got off the ground, but the dialogue for a number of years now has been that the North Sydney Bears would effectively relocate to Perth and become the Perth Bears and play a majority of their games in Perth and one or two in Sydney. But now the Newtown Jets have thrown their hat in the ring and are meeting with the executive chairman of the WA Consortium about the potential to step in for the Bears and bring back the Jets to the national competition in the form of a Perth-based team. And the WA bid has said that they're going to consider all the options about a potential marriage with either the Jets or the Bears. And they want both of those clubs to give a compelling case to tell the WA Consortium what they bring to the table that a standalone team couldn't put together themselves. And it is an interesting concept. I don't really think a relocated or reborn former NSWRL team changes anything in Perth, but when you consider that they are going to have a number of supporters in Sydney, it means that they are going to have significant away support when they do play in Sydney. And you're going to have those fans signing up for memberships, potentially flying over to Perth once or twice a year for a game, and it has the potential for that club actually to become quite big because they have a significant supporter base in two different markets. When you think of the Sydney Swans in the AFL, very well supported obviously in Sydney, but also in Melbourne, that South Melbourne supporter base is still there and they do draw very well when they are playing in Melbourne. And because Perth is a relatively new market for the NRL, most of those supporters aren't going to have any connection with an existing team. So it really doesn't matter to them whether it is a new franchise born out of nowhere or it is connected to a historic franchise in Sydney, because they had no connection to, say, the Newtown Jets or the North Sydney Bears before they started playing in Perth. Not many potential AFL supporters in Sydney care that the Swans used to be South Melbourne because they either weren't born when that was the case or they didn't follow the game of Australian rules football at all, so it's really irrelevant. Unlike the PNG case, a WA bid is self-funding, which we knew. The WA government is hugely supportive of the bid, and they're not in the business of propping up teams, but it is the bid's understanding that they will help in terms of upgrades around HBF Park and investment pathways and programs for rugby league. I'm not really sure what they're talking about in terms of the stadium. You don't really need to do anything to the stadium. It's already in a decent condition. It did get a big renovation in the mid-2010s. the NRL has played a few games here and there at the ground before. We know the Western Force in the Super Rugby do play there, as well as Perth Glory in the A-League Soccer. And I think HBF Park would be a top 8 or 10 NRL stadium. So you really don't have to do much, maybe a few amenities, concession stands, etc., but nothing major. So that can't be more than a couple of $1 million. And it goes on to say that the Perth bid is very financially sound and there's plenty of support. You are going to get a lot of support from sponsors. And the WA population is very parochial, so they will get behind this team, even though there's not a great existing rugby league fan base in WA. But you do have to consider there is a lot of New Zealanders who have migrated to Perth because of the mining industry and the money that can be made in Perth, who would support the team, you would think. The Bears will look to play 1 or 2 games at North Sydney Oval, but would be a WA team. They will stay and play in Perth. 116 years of history in Sydney won't go away, but what they will have is 2 cities with 1 future. So it's very much the Sydney Swans model that they are looking to employ here. And I think it makes sense. If this WA team could straight off the bat have 3,000 or 4,000 fans in Sydney, or even more potentially, they'd be off to a great start. And you'd already be ahead of teams like the Cowboys or the Dolphins or the Melbourne Storm, which really don't have any fans in Sydney. So it does ask a question, does this mean the PNG bid is dead? And more pertinently, should the PNG bid be dead? And I think the answer, while it is dependent purely on federal funding, is that it would be a massive risk for the NRL to go ahead with the PNG team. I mean, really, they should have gone into Perth a long time ago. They were there in the form of the Western Reds, but obviously with the Super League situation back in the late 90s, they did lose a couple of teams in Perth and Adelaide. But definitely, I think they should have gone back before the Dolphins and arguably even before the Gold Coast Titans to Perth. And the article seems to be hinting that the NRL is going to be pitching for the 18th and 19th licenses at the same time, which logically you would think they are going to be going to 20 within the next 8 or 10 years, I would say. And there has been a lot of dialogue about another New Zealand-based team, which does make sense. We do know the Warriors are absolutely killing it at the moment. They've had something like 12 or 13 consecutive sellouts of their home ground. And if you put another team either in Wellington or Christchurch, and Christchurch does seem to be a little bit of a stronger scenario in terms of media talk lately, you would potentially split that Warriors fan base and tap into a new market in the South Island of New Zealand if you were to go to Christchurch. And from more reports, rugby league is booming in New Zealand. A lot of frustration with rugby union around the send-offs, around the scrums, the amount of stoppages, the amount of penalties that are blown. So it's a big growth area for New Zealand. And in terms of stadiums in New Zealand, they do have Sky Stadium in Wellington, which is about 25 years old at this point. There's nothing wrong with it, but it is an oval stadium, not the best for rectangular sports. But they are building a brand new, amazing looking stadium in Christchurch with a translucent roof, state-of-the-art building that seats around 30,000. And we do know in terms of New Zealand teams playing in Australian domestic competitions, there is none in the city of Christchurch. So potentially that would be a big carrot there for the NRL to chase. And it hasn't really been talked about, but if I'm the NRL, I'm bidding PNG and I'm going into Adelaide. And you would say it's a risk. Rugby league, again, similar to Perth, although it's a much smaller market, does not have a big footprint in Adelaide, but at some point you need to live up to your name. You are the National Rugby League. You need to be brave and go into a new untapped market. It is the 5th biggest city in Australia. Like West Australians, South Australians are very parochial, so they would get behind the team. You do have Hindmarsh Stadium, which is very similar to HBF Park in Perth. You wouldn't have to do much to it. And you would be adding to the TV rights because you are putting new franchises in the 4th and 5th biggest cities in Australia. I just don't see how Papua New Guinea adds anything to the Australian aspect of the competition. So it is very interesting, and it sounds like we will get an announcement after the next State of Origin game that the NRL is expanding to 18 and 19 teams, and it'll be very much watch this space in terms of what comes from that. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video, and make sure you subscribe for more.